I think I started Telos mostly because I felt like a lot of information about neurodiversity either wasn't accessible
Mm,
or it was framed in a very clinical lens and wasn't
yeah.
made for people, say, my age, or by people who are actually neurodivergent and have lived
Mhm.
experiences. I also noticed that when there were conversations about neurodiversity and people with, say, developmental conditions, etc., a lot of it was framed as like this person's struggles or their hardships. And while so many aspects of neurodiversity are inherently like disabling and in our society today can be very
Mhm.
difficult for many people, I also wanted to bring that conversation to talk about how everyone can find purpose in their life and bring joy and meaning to their own story.
Welcome back to another episode of Living with FASD, and this will be one of our playlist episodes for putting fetal alcohol spectrum disorders square within the midst of many, many different types of neurodiversity and exploring how some of our quirks may be experienced the same, how they may be experienced differently. But today I am absolutely delighted to bring to you someone that I have recently made their acquaintance, Aeris Wren, who is a youth advocate for neurodiversity and is also a podcast host. So, Aeris, welcome. And I've got all kinds of questions for you about youth advocate. For how long and why and the whole nine yards. So, welcome to Living with FASD.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Patty, for having me on this show. I'm really honored to be
Yeah.
here. And thank you for the very kind introduction. My name is Aeris. I'm an AuDHD high school student currently, and I host a podcast called Telos, a neurodiversity conversation, where I talk about things like neurodiversity, executive functioning, and what it's like to grow up neurodivergent and also find one's purpose in that space.
You are so far ahead of the game. I mean, figuring all this out at such a young age. So, what gave you the idea for podcasting?
Yeah, for sure. I think I started Telos mostly because I felt like a lot of information about neurodiversity either wasn't accessible
Mm,
or it was framed in a very clinical lens and wasn't
yeah.
made for people, say, my age, or by people who are actually neurodivergent and have lived
Mhm.
experiences. I also noticed that when there were conversations about neurodiversity and people with, say, developmental conditions, etc., a lot of it was framed as like this person's struggles or their hardships. And while so many aspects of neurodiversity are inherently like disabling and in our society today can be very
Mhm.
difficult for many people, I also wanted to bring that conversation to talk about how everyone can find purpose in their life and bring joy and meaning to
Yeah.
their own story.
Yeah. I think that's just incredible. How long have you been putting Telos out there into the world?
Yeah, I've been hosting the podcast for around 2 years now. So I
That's
started
incredible.
in fall of 2024, if I recall. Yes.
That's absolutely incredible. What is the response that you get from the other kids in your school?
Yeah, I think our generation right now is kind of in this turning point where we're questioning systems more, like
Mhm.
education, mental health, all of it, but we're still often talked about, not with. So I think bringing Telos to my school, for instance, and telling my classmates about it has had really positive reception because we all
Mm,
want to create spaces where younger neurodivergent people can actually
yeah,
understand themselves earlier,
yeah,
understand maybe older people who can inspire them and
yeah,
not just grow up thinking they're like bad or broken, that sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah. I think I know my older brother really, really struggled. I think he would have, at the very least, if which type do they call it? It used to be called Asperger's.
Yes.
I I think um I think he and as well as his son does carry that diagnosis, but I think he would have also, and I think my father would have also, had it been a thing when either of them were growing up. So, I mean, my brother's 71 at this point. Certainly, that was not even thought of, right? The concept of neurodiversity was not even thought of back then. And my father was actually made to sit in the corner literally with a dunce cap on.
No.
And he had patents. He was very inventive and had things decades ahead of time. Like back in the 70s, he made a machine to create ozone.
Wow.
You know,
That is really interesting.
he was always decades ahead of his time. And, I remember one time he decided to invest money into insulin that could be inhaled. And and I've actually used that product with wonderful results that I wish he were still around to have realized that dream, which he had, because one week when my mom wasn't around, he had to be the one to give me my shots when I was in 3rd grade. That's probably when he decided there's got to be a better way. I know I was glad when she came home too. You're so right. Questioning the systems. And I think there's a lot to that, Aeris, really, because we turn to the quote unquote experts, trusting that they have the answers, especially concerned parents. They're desperate to make the world a better place for their child that they can see is really struggling, and they're clueless as to how do we help. And so they turn to the experts and realize, oh, these people don't know any more than I do.
Yeah.
But the professionals can't use things they've never been taught. And if you go up a layer, the schools, the graduate school programs, whether it's medicine or social work or psychology or whatever, they can't teach what they've never experienced. And it's just that, there's a whole pervasive switch that needs to happen to get us away from the behavior paradigm that says all behaviors are intentional, they're chosen. And if you can't figure out the motivation, it must be secondary gain. Unconsciously, there's a reason they made that choice. It's because they want negative attention. Please give me a break. But that's not it, because so oftentimes, when people use the word behavior, always seems to be referenced in terms of bad behavior, right? And for the listening audience, I'm doing air quotes when I say that, because behaviors, it's not moral. It's not good versus bad. We have to get to the point where we realize so many times what looks like bad behavior or negative behavior or disruptive behavior is really a cry for help that comes from our chronic pain and frustration of not having our needs met, not understanding how to meet them better. And nobody around us knows to do that either. And in the meantime, we get blamed, shamed, and punished.
Yeah.
For things that we can't control because the way that we're wired. Yeah.
I think as someone who's AuDHD, so I'm autistic and I also have ADHD, I've experienced that a lot, where what I'm struggling with, for instance, gets misinterpreted either because it doesn't fit into only one of those diagnostic criteria, traits, etc. And or it looks like something else from the outside. It looks like I'm being precocious, for instance, that sort of thing. I mean, I can tell a bit of a story. For instance, I can come off as quite disinterested if something isn't a special interest of mine.
Okay.
But it's not that I don't care. It's more so my brain has a really hard time activating without that interest-based connection, which is something that shows up in a lot of ADHD research around motivation and dopamine. But when I was younger, this would look like a lot of times my teachers would have to go, Aeris, can you repeat what I just said back to me? And I would repeat exactly what they said because I was actually listening. I just didn't really want to engage with that content. So I wasn't listening in the way you would expect a neurotypical child to listen. So like eye contact, facing forward, etc.
Sitting still for hours at a time.
Yeah. And there's so much conflicting information around, I think, education specifically for neurodiverse kids, because if all these children, for instance, listen differently, Why do we say things like, oh, you need to have quiet hands, so you can't fidget? Why do you have to look at the teacher, etc.? Or else, maybe your green card in the little kindergarten box gets moved down to red for not paying attention.
Yeah. They didn't have those when I was a kid, so I
Mm,
hadn't come up with that analogy yet. That is so true. There's not understanding what can help someone with those ADHD traits.
mm.
It's just like everybody knows somebody who in a meeting has been the doodler,
Yes.
right? Or there might be the foot tapper that drives a lot of people crazy with whether it's a hard enough tap against the table leg to get, depending if it's a folding table, then they move a
Mm,
lot when you tap that leg, or just the noise of the tapping. It can be very distracting for others, but for the person who needs that little bit of movement to take just away enough that you can actually take the information in.
mhm.
I'm sure you can explain that better.
I would say that, of course, I'm not an expert, but just with my conversations with people all over the neurodiversity umbrella who identify as neurodivergent themselves, as well as research, usually when it comes to, say, sensory input, there tends to be individuals who are sensory seeking. So
Yeah.
they can't fully engage if they're not receiving some form of sensory
Mhm.
stimulation. Stimming, for instance. So that might
Yeah.
look like playing with a fidget ball or tapping the table. And this is all to self regulate. But you
Yeah.
also get people who are more sensory avoidant or
Mhm.
sensitive. And
Mhm.
these are people who, for instance, if you're in a very busy meeting room and everyone's
Mhm.
yelling at each other and shaking hands, they might seem like they're disengaging or
Yeah.
not focusing or being rude.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you think of the typical classroom, I mean, there's the acoustics are terrible.
Yes.
So there's a lot of reverberation. There's usually tile floor. And when
Mhm.
the chair legs move against that, that's a screech that most people can tune out. But, some of us, we have trouble tuning that out.
Mhm.
I mean, there's just so much going on there. And, I've, one thing that I even tried to do it for my house was to get one of those giant exercise balls,
Oh, yeah.
right? And I actually got it actually to help me recover from back surgery, to
Mm.
keep my core strong so that the next vertebrae up didn't start to go.
Right.
But I figured it would also help with this whole thing about needing just that minor movement and stimulation in order to focus. Because otherwise, if you're forced to sit still when your body needs to move, then more of your attention goes to, I have to sit still. I
Mhm.
have to sit still. I don't want to sit still. I have to sit still. And meanwhile, who knows what you're missing as the teacher goes, wah, 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 wah.
Yeah,
What she says has no
absolutely.
meaning because I've been focused on sitting still. At least we no longer have teachers that come around with a ruler to smack your hand
For sure.
when your hands aren't being quiet.
Yeah.
So, what when you have had incidents in, say in the classroom or wherever, what has it been like to advocate for yourself? Obviously now you're a terrific advocate, but
Mhm.
I'm sure that hasn't always been the case. What was it like to get that transition from having your parents advocate on your behalf to learning how to explain things yourself? And what was that process like for you?
Definitely. I think a big part of how I learned to advocate for myself, which, by the way, it was not very easy at first, right? It was always very awkward when I was first, for instance, asking for accommodations, telling my teacher, hey, actually, I have, extra time on this test. So can I please keep working on it? That sort of thing. Something really important for me, that turning point was understanding how my brain works and then communicating what I need in a clear way. For example, I've learned that I process information a lot better with captions. So I would have a bit of a script for myself when asking teachers or people of authority for captions by using tools that provide captions, asking for written support when I need it. And when something isn't working, I try to speak up about it in a way that frames it as curious, right? So, like,
Mm.
why do you structure your classroom this way? Why is this lesson structured this way? So that whoever I'm talking to realizes that my needs are not an attack against their framework,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
ignoring needs usually
Yeah.
makes things harder for them as well in the long
Yeah.
run.
Yeah. And I think too, I know we've run into this so often in the educational system. Teachers are exhausted. They,
Yes.
yeah, it's a short work day compared to the 9 to 5. But what people don't realize is that teachers continue to do their work at home after they've tended to their own families. They work on weekends. And even though they have summers off, they still have meetings they have to go to, things. The school year for teachers ends later and starts earlier. So they don't have quite the time off that we think they do.
Mhm.
Still, it's more than the 2 weeks the rest of us get, right?
Mhm.
But all that being said, they have a classroom of 30, 35, 40 kids, a lot of whom are neurodiverse, but maybe don't qualify or need special ed.
Mhm.
And so that's a lot to manage, and trying to pay attention to everyone's unique needs. And a lot of times they're just so overwhelmed, like, I don't have the time to invest or the energy to invest on learning this one kid when
Yeah.
I've got all these others, right? But what they fail to appreciate, not just teachers in the education system, but maybe a boss in the corporate world, you know, has the same kind of thought. I have a whole team to manage, and here I've got this one problem kid, right? Or problem adult,
Mm.
problem team member. If you learn to interact with people assuming that everyone is neurodiverse in some way or another, and just interact with everybody as unique beings, that brings honor to everybody and actually makes the job as supervisor or teacher a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And jump in at any moment because I'm sure you have, experience in, for instance, the social work sector when we're talking about specifically self-regulation. But I think it's really
Mhm.
interesting that self-regulation is not an innate skill, but one that develops through co-regulation, right?
Mhm.
This is more so like in regards to children who are developing their self-regulation skills.
Mhm.
But we're also always constantly learning how to self regulate, how
Mhm.
to manage our own perspectives and minds. And let's say there's a child who becomes really distracted during an overwhelming activity. So they throw a tantrum, they don't want to focus. No punishment or reward based intervention is going to help that child get back to the task at hand. Like, we're not exactly understanding why that child is displaying that behavior if we just say, hey, if you stop crying right now, I'll give you chocolate, or if you don't stop crying, you don't get to go to recess, or
Yep.
anything like that. Instead, a teacher might have to sit beside them, help them take a
Mhm.
break, guide them through a calming routine. And that's really just like showing them the tools and helping them
Yeah.
learn how to use them.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems amazing now that none of us knew what we didn't know until we finally learned it, right?
Yes.
General principle, give everybody grace because of that.
Mhm.
None of us knew what we didn't know until we learned it. And it's now that we know all these things about neurodiversity, it seems incredulous to believe
Mm.
that people could have that thought process. I'm going to yell at
Yes.
this kid until they can regulate themselves. Well, how in the
No.
world would that ever work? If someone's getting yelled at, whether by a teacher or a parent, or they're being shamed by a therapist, I was like, you believe that?
Mm.
All all these messages of judgment, whether or not there's punishment that comes with the judgment. If there's judgment, then you're on the defensive. You're never going to be able to regulate yourself if you're on the defensive. Why is that such a hard concept for people to get?
Mm.
Sometimes I think maybe it's just turning it around. If you have those conversations after the big blow up, right? And say, wow, well, can you think of a time when you felt judged or you felt, cornered? What was
Mm.
that like for you? And what enabled you to stop paying attention to to how awful it felt and move on with life? What helped you to be able to make that switch? And how can you, now that you appreciate that, how can you help me do a better job next time?
Mm. Mhm. I
So,
agree. There really needs to be a dynamic interaction between the
mhm,
individual and their environment. so that,
Mhm.
regardless of the person's neurotype, it's more so just understanding and giving that person grace before
Yeah.
jumping to assumptions, right?
Yeah. I had a guest on my show. I can't think of it at okay, now I know who it was.
Mhm.
But you remember in math class when they talk about the bell curve, right?
Mm,
And it's statistical averages, right? Most people are up here in the bell somewhere, and then you have these outliers on either end.
mm,
But she said, in actuality, the neurotypical, and again to the listening audience as opposed to the viewing audience, I just did air quotes.
mm,
The neurotypical perspective truly is that top 1% at the very tippy
mm,
top of the bell. Everything to either side is a degree of neurodivergence, one way or the other. And that
mhm.
really reframes things that we who accept ourselves for our differences, we're the norm. Okay.
Yes.
And let's just embrace it. And again, go back to seeing everybody as unique individuals.
Mhm. Yeah, I think like it's so important to clarify. And I talk to so many people about this because there's misinformation about what neurodiversity is.
Mhm.
Neurodiversity is an umbrella term. It refers
Mhm.
to just the general understanding that neurological differences are natural
Yeah.
variations of the human brain.
Yes.
When we put it like that, such neurological differences include anything from developmental conditions like ADHD,
Mhm.
like autism spectrum disorder,
Like
but also
like
learning
FASD.
disabilities like FASD, like mood disorders,
Yeah.
like neurological conditions like concussions and epilepsy. There are so many different cognitive
Yeah.
variations that I would say it's very rare to be inherently neurotypical, actually.
Right? That dovetails straight into what I was just talking about with the bell curve, right?
Yeah.
But we think about the neurodivergent world, right, as being the dominant, just about everybody fits in this box. Yeah, no, we don't. There's a
Mhm.
lot of people that don't fit, but they've figured out ways of making themselves fit without having a really complicated life.
Yes,
Oh.
I think it's also super important to talk about how, although neurodivergent experiences can overlap so much,
Mhm.
it's not as if like there are two boxes and you're either neurotypical or you're neurodivergent, and then
Yeah.
everyone here is all the same, right?
Right.
There can be, difficulty with attention or regulation or
Mhm.
processing information and come from very drastically different underlying traits or causes.
Mhm. Yeah, I saw a post this morning on LinkedIn from one of my favorite ADHD posters,
Mhm.
and it was saying, "Did you know that these are because it's Autism Acceptance Month?
Yes.
You know, all these different symptoms are symptoms of autism. Did you know
Mm.
this?" Right? And of course, I had to put a comment in there saying every single one of them also points to FASD.
Yes. Yes.
But it's the FASD is the elephant in the room, right? We
Mm.
seem to be left out of almost all the conversations about neurodivergence. And I don't know, is it the stigma because mom drank? Some of us have been told that it's not a real neurodivergence because it was caused by our mothers.
Mm.
Well, yeah, but it caused changes in us to our
Yes.
neurology and also to our physical bodies. Well, the brain is a physical part of our body, but you know what I mean? It might, because everything is affected by the alcohol. So it
Yeah.
could be our skeleton system, it could be our muscular system, it could be our gut. I mean, just there's not a system of our body that's not impacted.
I think another piece is that different neurotypes have
Mhm.
very different patterns of support needs and
Yeah.
communication styles. And
Yeah.
when people aren't familiar with those patterns, it can lead to misinterpretation, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, even with classifying support needs, if someone has usually a pattern of low support needs, so they're able to essentially function in the society on their own, but on one day they have a really bad meltdown and
Mhm.
are non-speaking or have a verbal shutdown, they might be classified then technically as having higher support needs. And people
Mhm.
aren't familiar with that change in pattern. If someone with FASD has difficulty with memory or processing, but they usually don't on any other given day, someone might misunderstand that as inconsistency or like this person's not
Right.
trying, when in reality, it's a brain-based difference there.
Right. Exactly. They call that inconsistent mastery. And whether
Mm,
that's applied to memory and access to memory, learning something one day and the next day, yeah, it's like you never even spend any time helping them to learn this particular thing, or whether it's
mhm,
a skill, life skill, and it's the most confusing thing for parents, for teachers, for bosses and coworkers. You could do it, spouses can be very
mm,
confused by this as well. "Hey, you could do it before. Why can't you do it now? Or why
mm.
won't you do it now?" But it's not a
Um,
won't issue. It's a can't.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like if it's confusing for a loved one, for instance, imagine how confusing it is for the person actually living
Hmm.
with this change or incongruence in
Yeah.
their abilities and how
Yeah.
much shame and pain that probably comes with.
Exactly. I'm not sure what the overlap is between the other neurotypes like ADHD or autism or AUDHD or cerebral palsy
Mm,
or any of the others. Anxiety and depression are so prevalent among those with FASD. But really is it and those we call those secondary symptoms, right? Because
mhm,
they're not the direct reflection of the changes in the brain from the alcohol effect, but they are the very predictable response to an environment that doesn't support that person in it.
yes.
Um, and is it any wonder if you're someone who struggles with inconsistent mastery, then you wake up each and every day wondering if your brain's going to be there for you reliably to get through a
Mm.
certain class or a certain meeting or a certain presentation or whatever you have planned for that day. Or is your brain going to say, sorry, I'm AWOL?
Mm,
Because sometimes that happens,
mhm,
and it,
yeah.
it is hard. So no wonder there's so much anxiety. And when we keep reaping the consequences of disappointing ourselves and others, no wonder there's so much depression.
Mhm. I
Makes
think
perfect
it's
sense.
yeah, when you see people who are neurodiverse show up in need of psychiatric care or care
Mhm,
because they're in crisis or have gone through a lot of trauma,
mhm,
oftentimes I think medical practitioners and professionals, the knee jerk instinct is to ask, like, why are they in crisis? When in reality, I think for a lot of these people, going into crisis, going into secondary symptoms, for instance, is a perfectly valid reaction of their brain being
mhm.
systemically denied and
Yeah,
invalidated their whole
yeah,
life.
yeah,
So the root cause isn't that, like, they're depressed. It's that, they're misunderstood and don't have their needs met. And
right.
thus, of course, they're feeling depressed.
Yeah, yeah. If our basic needs, Eris, are to know that that we matter
Mm,
to somebody or to feel that we are seen or heard or valued
yes.
or to be able to make sense of the world and our place within it. Those are our three basic needs as humans.
Mm,
You know, it involves how we interact with the world and our ability to connect, right? If those things aren't met, then we're not going to function well in any of our roles in life because we're going to
mhm,
be continually trying to get those needs met. And if we're
yeah.
not, somehow somebody has to be able to see that those needs aren't met. But
Mhm,
it's very rare that people stop and think about these are the needs that my kid has.
mhm,
Are they being met? What can I do to help that? Basically the questions need to be, where's the stuck spot and how can I help?
mhm.
If we go
I
through
agree.
life interacting with everybody with those two questions in mind, boy, wouldn't it be a better place?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It looks like you were going to say something.
I was just thinking back to our earlier discussions around why FASD, for instance, can be so misunderstood even in neurodiverse communities and spaces. And another thing I've noticed when we're talking about needing to validate people and make sure everyone understands that they're understood and heard and supported is that there can be a lot of bias and hierarchy in the neurodiversity space, especially around FASD. And I don't really understand why, but I would say, especially when people associate the FASD spectrum with intellectual disability, when people then who are of different neurotypes believe that they're, say, better, air quotes, or more capable in comparison, which
Yeah.
creates a really unhelpful hierarchy because everyone here has individual strengths and needs that are not prioritized by mainstream society. So
Yeah.
I feel like the response of then having a hierarchy within that already marginalized space is really unhelpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I chimed in on a post the other day about that, where once again, there was a list posted and we weren't on it.
Yeah.
And I had to point out, like, everybody knows how awful it feels to feel othered.
Mhm.
And yet, there's the assumption that within the neurodiversity space, we would find inclusion, and yet we feel othered by the people that
Mhm.
never put this neurotype on the list,
Mhm.
despite the fact that alcohol exposure is the number one cause of neurodevelopmental disorders in the Western world. It's the elephant in the room, right?
Mhm.
I keep using that example, but it does make perfect sense.
Our diversity spaces are at their best when they're really intentional about
Yeah.
inclusion, especially for conditions that are less represented, traits that are less represented. I know there's a lot of conversation about, for instance, in the autism community, how we advocate for those with higher support needs, those who might be non-speaking and thus can't, for instance, be on a podcast and share their experiences,
Yeah.
but their experiences are just as valid.
Yeah.
So being open to learning about neurotypes we might not be as
Yeah.
familiar with is
Yeah.
so valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the point that I was wanting to respond to, was that
Mm,
whole idea about how valid it is to pair FASD with the intellectual disability.
yes.
And I think that that fits both within the neurodiverse community, but also within what the general public understands about
Hmm.
FASD. Because, everything that Dr. Google puts out there is accurate.
Yeah.
Like the hashtag Beyond 34, because one of the things that people stumble across when their kid's diagnosed is, oh my God, the life expectancy is 34.
Um,
Oh, and they start grieving when there's no need to grieve, right?
right.
Because that was based on one study, and it was a fairly small study. It was never repeated. And the subjects of the study were all people who had horrible outcomes because
Mm,
their needs had never been identified or supported.
mm,
And back then, in the early years, I mean, knowing about FASD, it's only been 53 years at this point. That's
wow.
nothing.
Yeah.
That's nothing. But back then, all of the studies were on the worst case scenarios where,
Mhm.
it's just all the people had terrible outcomes because nobody knew what was going on with them until all of a sudden, oh, FASD, that's a thing. That fits, right? And back then, researchers didn't look at strengths
Mhm.
and how someone's strengths really mitigate, you know, how people experience the challenges in the way that their brains are able to control what's going on, how they interact with the world and everything else. So there's a lot of that. And even moving forward, now today's crop of researchers who are just finishing in grad school or in their 30s, they want to explore all these ideas. They want
Mhm.
to do research that is driven by living experience and the
Mm,
wisdom that those of us who live with these conditions, whether it's FASD or something else, but who pays for the research? Who decides which projects get invested in or don't? The people that sit in those chairs are still stuck in those early years where no one looked at strengths.
Yeah.
Where, the subjects were people that had not been supported in time. The earlier someone's diagnosed, the earlier they can find support. And so that affects, I think, the knowledge in the general population, which includes those of us who are neurodiverse. So we all have
Absolutely.
this misunderstanding, misinformation, and a skewed perception.
Yeah. And it's up to, this next generation and everyone out there who wants to feel more empowered in their purpose as well to essentially get to those decision-making rooms if that's, something they're interested in. Because then when we bring in lived experience to the people who actually make the decisions and call the shots, that's how we're truly represented. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the wonderful thing about the autism movement. There's been such wonderful progress in their advocacy as a movement. They're like 20, 25, 30 years ahead of those of us in the FASD space. There was that same degree of stigma for autism where it was blamed, where the mothers were being blamed for their children's struggles because they were cold and aloof and emotionally unavailable. Well, now we know, no, it's neurology. There's just so much, or othering FASD because it's the mom's alcohol use. Well, according to Ira Chasnoff, who's a teratologist, looking at teratogens, the number one cause of ADHD is maternal smoking.
Wow.
Yeah. Is it the only cause? Of course not. But it's the number one cause, according to what he found. So how is that different, maternal smoking versus maternal drinking? Women are going to make the healthy choices for their child once they know they're pregnant. But by then, damage is done. So, yeah, not the baby's fault.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not the baby's fault. They didn't choose that. So, yeah, it is such a delight to talk with you, Aeris.
Thanks.
I'm thinking back to my own high school years, and I don't know anyone that I went to school with that I could have had such an in-depth, meaningful conversation about.
I appreciate it.
I mean, it's just, but we do when we have neurodiversity, we grow up fast in a lot of ways. We may have developmental delays in a few areas, but there are other areas where we are forced to be an advanced place.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I can remember as a kid, even in first grade, and when you have health class, like 15 or 20 minutes in the middle of the day. Okay, we're going to learn about blah, blah, blah. And the teachers would say something about diabetes, and I'd be in the back of the room. Excuse me, that's wrong. That's not right. And I'm glad that a lot of people with a living experience with different neurotypes are now feeling more comfortable to be able to say, excuse me.
Yes.
That's wrong. Let's help you understand it. And I think that's where shows like yours and mine come into play, and the important work that we have to do in the world, shine a light on what our experiences have been like, how we can support one another. Yeah. What are your dreams for the future, Aeris?
For the future, that is a really big question. I think they really are centered around accessibility and inclusion. I want to see a world where young people don't have to spend years feeling misunderstood before they even have like the language to explain their experiences properly. And I really hope there are more tools and resources that help people understand themselves, because I think understanding is one of the first steps to support and self-compassion as well. And long term, I hope to keep building safe spaces where everyone can feel seen and respected as individuals, as like groups specifically, or labels, that sort of thing.
That's a very odd paradox that we have in our society. Hopefully you can't hear my dogs. I closed the blinds hoping it would keep them quiet. But we are all unique, right? Every single person alive is unique, as you said earlier. You know, it's just a normal, diversity is normal within the human race across every domain. But we all have our own unique combination of strengths and interests and challenges and preferred learning styles, our own unique set of needs. And all of that together is as unique to us as our fingerprint is.
Yes.
And something really to celebrate the diversity, because how boring would it be if we were all the same? You know? And yet our society wants, at the same time, it's normal to think that everyone else processes what's going on the way that we do. You know, we're very egocentric as a species. It's the natural inclination, and it takes a lot of discipline to always be looking for the diversity instead of assuming it's the same. And yet at the same time, with that human experience, we all go through things and might look a little different, but the nuts and bolts are the same.
I agree.
Yeah. This has been such a delightful conversation, and I can't wait to see where you go in life.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Patti.
If you're
Really
doing all
appreciate
this and you're still in high school, watch out, world. Aeris Wren is on the scene.
it.
I treasure the fact that we ran into one another, and I hope that my audience will follow your podcast. So everybody, if you're watching or listening, don't forget to go into the show notes so that you can get the link to Aeris's page and be able to follow, because it's good stuff. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and have a good day.
You too. And it's not that, well, the recordings come out on Mondays, but we're actually sitting down on a Friday. So have a good weekend. All right, everybody, that's a wrap. We will see you next time on Living with FASD. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Living with FASD. Hopefully, this episode added to the breadth and depth of your knowledge about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and I hope that it also made you laugh along the way. Please email me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com if there are any comments you want to make, questions that you want to ask, topics you want me to cover, or people that you think would make a great guest for the show. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share the podcast. By helping my podcast grow, you will be doing your part to help raise awareness and understanding about FASD, which is something we surely can agree needs to happen. I also wanted to remind you to look in the show notes if you would like to order a copy of my book, Sip by Sip, Candid Conversations with Adults Living with FASD. You can find the ordering link in the show notes, and it is now also available in large print. If you find, like me, find that words tend to swim on the page if the font is too small. Also in the show notes, you will find a Calendly link, which is my e-calendar. If you want to reach out to me and talk about any coaching needs that you might have for you or someone in your family, or if you want to talk about training, if you want me to bring me into your community organization or the company that you work for, I'm happy to do trainings about FASD as well. So those things are available to you. And this time, as always, if there are links or books or whatever else that my guest has brought to the show, you'll find those links in the show notes as well. Anyway, that's a wrap for today. I hope that you have a good week, and we will see you next time on Living with FASD.